the traditional land of the Dakota people, and just honor with gratitude the land itself and those people who have come before those of us who now live on that land, stewarding it and continuing to honor the gifts that the land has to offer to all of us. We are really delighted to have Flint with us, so I will provide just a brief introduction to Flint, and then we'll have just an opening chant and we'll turn it over to him. So Flint is a retired psychologist, and for the most important purposes of our time together this weekend, a Zen Buddhist teacher in the Soto Zen tradition. He's been a part of this growing community in Minnesota since 2017, and I know many of the people on this meeting today come from communities where Flint's been involved for even longer than that. So we've been really grateful for Flint's teaching and stewardship of our growing community and our practices of moving towards growing up and waking up, as Flint is oftentimes encouraging us to do. So we will turn over the video to Flint, and Bill, do you want to pull up the Dharma verse? So our first more formal moment, we will read a verse that just invites us to sort of turn our attention and open up to the teaching that's about to be offered to us. So if you feel comfortable, we'll invite you just to bow. A little bit of an echo. All right. So if you want to hold your hands like this, if you feel comfortable, and I will read this chant. The Dharma is subtle, vast, and deep, delightful and lovely. We now have a chance to see it, hear it, feel it, receive it, and embody it in practice. We vow to realize its true meaning. I will turn it over to Flint.
Thank you very much, Ryan. As is often the case, when we sort of open the door to the Zendo, in this case, the cloud Zendo that we're sharing, it's so inspiring to see everyone file in and to see faces, most of whom I've been with in one place or another. With the great preponderance of people being from Minnesota, I said earlier, I feel like in some way my spirit gets called there. And so it's wonderful to see all of you from every place. I come to you today from land that was settled many centuries ago by the native Hawaiian people, coming from the lower Polynesian islands in the Pacific, then was settled by King Kamehameha, and later the great nation of Hawaii flourished here. So we honor those peoples as we continue. I was happy to see the Dharma verse that we just read and chanted together and had a feel for. The classical verse that comes before a Dharma talk, the English translation that I'm familiar with, sounds much more formal, a different kind of language, but listen to how it goes. An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. So it's a little more bracing, in some ways, with the same message. An unsurpassable and perfect Dharma, which puts the person in this seat in a little strange position, The Dharma is clear, and we do our best to transmit it in some ways to each other. through our care for each other, through our attention that we turn to each other, through our loving presence with each other. An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma that pervades all of us is rarely met with through large expanses of time. I vow to taste, and in the other verse that we have, these various ways in which we, through our senses, take in the Dharma, not just understand intellectually, but take it in through our bodies, is so important. I vow to taste the truth. And so I hope that is our experience through this weekend retreat. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your commitment and willingness to gather, and for the attention and the precious, precious time that you're offering by gathering in this way. These are moments in our lives that are unique, that we won't have again. And so to bring them together and turn them toward the Dharma and towards each other's care is not a small offering. It's really profound. I have a habit, as many of you know, which is to open almost every retreat by reviewing the advertisement, the description of the retreat. It's like, are we in the right place? What is it that we thought we were doing? Because I know some of us, I have done this. I sign up because I'm interested in being with the community or the people who I love, or the teacher that I want to be with. And then it's like, oh, by the way, what are they teaching? But it's good maybe to think about this, because as I have endeavored to call together teachings and my own attention to the matter, I've followed what I initially hoped the teachings might be, what Ryan and the entire community came together to invite me to teach about, and how they shaped the language and the feel and the invitation. So it's worth reviewing. The title for the retreat that you are now in, if you did not know that, is Finding Our Way Home. Walking the Bodhisattva Path when our world is spinning. Finding our way home. Walking the Bodhisattva path when our world is spinning. Actually, that's a nice description of Zen practice, period. The description that was offered was, and I'm just reading the words, that when confronted by circumstances not of our choosing, our normal, habitual, conventional, I would say, patterns and rhythms of doing life are disrupted. In other words, how life interferes with my personal dream. These inevitable disruptions, while frequently disorienting, also provide an opportunity to notice how we respond to change and see more clearly what guides and informs our decisions and actions. We get thrown off all the time. And practice is really about how do we utilize what we meet and turn it toward good. The next sentence says, as we shift our attention in this way, we discover that what we might ordinarily call problems are actually profound practice opportunities. And that's the practice turn. The question then comes in the description, how does a bodhisattva make the turn to meet these practice opportunities in the most wholesome manner? And the reminder that without mindful attention, we are easily pulled back into old patterns of conditioning and habit. It's everyday life. And the Bodhisattva vow invites and encourages us to meet life as it is, but calls forward our most skillful response to each moment, rather than just our habitual or automatic response. This commitment to awakening, this commitment to mindful attention, this commitment to this through this vow, is made manifest when we take responsibility for our motivations, our reactions, and act with clarity and shared purpose. And in this weekend intensive, we are told, we will explore the guiding principles of this turn, the precepts of the Bodhisattva way. Precepts provide a framework to support our individual and collective commitment to living fully and lovingly for the benefit of all beings. So this is a very nice description, I think. This is a teaching that is complete in itself. We're confronted by life. It doesn't match the way we thought it might go. We're constantly having to adapt. Remember, walking the Bodhisattva path as our world is spinning. And we can shift our attention, though, just from our habitual ways of being essentially asleep and our automatic to a wakeful, mindful, wholesome way of being, which is called the Buddha way. And the Bodhisattva precepts are some guides along the way to assist us. Finding our way home, that first part. My time in coming to Minneapolis began out of an invitation from the Minnesota Trauma Project. And so many of you are therapists, as I have been. And so finding our way home is a poetic way of talking about resilient coping on the everyday level. Coping with constant change and sometimes with dramatic or difficult circumstances, including trauma. And resilient coping is a marvelous and useful and essential piece of what it means to be alive and to flourish. Taking refuge in Buddhist practice is finding our way home on the spiritual level. Resilient coping is on the everyday psychological, social, relational level. Taking refuge is on the spiritual level, the practice level, always returning, always turning toward life as it is. We say at the end of the ceremony in which people receive and celebrate and take the precepts, is a small verse. It says, we live like a cloud in an endless sky, like a lotus in muddy water, one with the pure mind of Buddha. Some of you have heard this many times. Always returning to this dual nature on the everyday level, in the mud, with the lotus blossoming, and on this vast, inconceivable level, like a cloud in an endless sky. Those become one. And the precepts help us bring these things together. And when we put our hands together like this, as Ryan invited us to do, we're enacting the absolute and the relative, the sort of paradox of our existence, the merging of differences and unity, which we feel humbled in the face of. So walking the Bodhisattva path, when our world is spinning, the subtitle. These days, all of you could make a list of the way that your world is spinning. All you have to do is look around, turn on the news, and whether it's politics or economics, whether it's health and the pandemic, climate change, racial injustice, on and on and on it goes. It seems like in the last few years that spinning has at least impacted us or been brought, more home in some very, very painful ways, which calls us to practice, which I would imagine some of you are brought to. But there's an illusion that I just want to call our attention to. When you read such a title, Finding Our Way Home, and you read such a beautiful description of it, and walking the Bodhisattva path when our world is spinning, it sounds like something special, new, or lovely that we could follow. But you know what? The world is always spinning. Impermanence and change is the nature of all existence. And interdependence and mutual causality is the ground of everything that we live in. So practice is offered to help us navigate this kind of world, because there isn't another one. There isn't a not spinning world. There are moments when we find refuge, and hence we take that refuge. but it's always spinning. And so we began, and I'm just going to review this very briefly. We began, at least in Zen practice, with certain forms, which give us a way to enter this turn in the face of what we're becoming aware of in the spinning world. These forms are embodied and relational. As much as some of the teachings in Zen practice and some of the koans and old stories seem very perplexing, and hence people think that they're intellectual, it's all embodied and relational, really. You're asked to sit in certain ways, walk in certain ways, bow in certain ways, and then in the process, you're shaped by those activities, but you also discover in a very intimate and delicate way your own shape that you have taken in the world, both with your own heart and in connection with others. And this kind of practice, this embodied relational practice that Zen is at its heart, is only one form. There are many other practices and many other ways, even in Buddhism, but if you're practicing this way, these are the entry gates to this particular path. Most foundational is sitting, zazen, meditation, both alone and together. Walking, which is the continuation of zazen and movement. Once again, alone and together. In fact, these two represent the essential pieces of, I remember Norman Fisher saying one time, there are two aspects of Zen, sitting down and getting up. We sit and we get up and we walk into our life. And sitting and walking meditation, zazen and kinhin, formally, represent those in a very clarified way so we can study them. Chanting expresses the teachings with our voice and with our ears and with our bodies. That's another practice. Another embodied relational practice is bowing, a profound embodied expression of the Buddha way and sometimes a devotional aspect to that way, both alone and together. Study. But study of the Dharma and contemporary forms of deepening the Dharma, which bring it back into our embodied awareness, not just our intellect. It's good to understand. It's good to study. Where does it become alive? And in my list, lastly, relationships. Our friends and our teachers, our spiritual friends and our teachers, which means basically all beings become our teacher. So we sit, we walk, we chant, we bow, we study, we connect. And these are the various woven paths of Zen practice. I said just a little bit earlier that finding our way home, if we want to go home, what's the compass that orients us? What's the GPS? What's the Google map of Dharma here that helps us get home? I don't know how I would get around Honolulu without Waze. It's very difficult, we learned to do it. I remember when we used to use maps and I think, wow, that was really awkward. But it's all we had. The word refuge, as many of you know, that we use in Buddhism comes from a French root which means to fly home, to come back, to return, to take refuge is finding our way home. And what do we find our way home to? A wakeful nature in us, which we call Buddha, and in others. The way that the world naturally works when we begin to soften our own prescriptions and demands on it, that's called Dharma. And the beautiful friendship that helps us walk hand in hand, side by side, or at least walking with those we care about and who care about us without losing sight of them, is Sangha. So this is the way we find our way home to our deepest sense of truth and our natural self, the way the world actually works, and our friends who live it with us. And walking the Bodhisattva path, what are the signposts along the way that help us along? Well, those are the precepts, which we're going to be attending to. And by the way, part of the invitation here is because I believe that the Awakening Together Sangha is probably going to begin their first formal, structured precepts study program, like we've done at Appamada for years, like Open Doors Zen Community has done, and many others have studied the precepts in these formal ways of doing it, which sometimes can take a year or more. And so for many of you, this retreat is preparation, is orientation, is invitation to this kind of path. You may not be aware of this, but the precepts themselves are the one essential piece in Soto Zen, at least. I'll just talk about Zen practice now, that you find in lay ordination, which we call jukai, in priest ordination, tokudo, in Dharma transmission and Dharma entrustment for new teachers, in marriages ceremonies, and in funerals. Every major ceremony, every major celebration in the community of major life transitions are shaped around the precepts, all of them. So that's an interesting piece of information, because it says this is something that's absolutely at the center of practice and maybe the most essential thing in practice, this understanding of the precepts. And I would say, with a lot of energy actually, that the prime distinguishing factor between the wonderful and effective and powerful secular mindfulness practices, which are very popular, and Buddhism is precepts, which are part of Buddhist practice and not part of secular mindfulness. That ethical orientation, that profound challenge for vow to orient us to something beyond personal preference, begins to make Buddhist practice a spiritual or religious practice, if you want, rather than a secular practice that assists me in the things I'd like to do. Those are fine. And mindfulness is very powerful. It's not a spiritual practice unless the precepts are involved. It's my position as a teacher. So this, are you in the right retreat? We've kind of gone over what the entryway here. I hope so. In the Buddha's time, in the beginning, when the Buddha in northern India began to teach and ordain monks, there were no precepts. Remember, Siddhartha Gautama woke up, people began to gather around him because he seemed like a very powerful teacher among many teachers in northern India, the surrounds at that time in the period of his life. He came out of a Hindu tradition. There was no Buddhism, but he had a way of teaching and an understanding and a profound awakening that took him out of that tradition, but he was still embedded in it. There were no precepts that he was teaching at that time. But, and here's the essential thing, as people gathered around him, followed him, asked for his teachings, and he began to ordain monks, so there began to be communities in different places, difficulties arose, because guess what? There were people together. And every difficulty that human beings encounter was encountered among these people that were following the Buddha. So as these difficulties, inevitable human difficulties arose, guidelines were created to protect the community as well as to protect the minds and hearts of those who were practicing. And so this is another important piece. The precepts are a protection. Like, for example, many of you understand the word that we use for our home community in Austin that Peg and I began, appamada. That word, appamada, suggests diligent, mindful care, but part of the essence of that word in Sanskrit has to do with a protection, protecting the mind and the heart, protecting practice by the way it's held. And so this is what the precepts began. I believe that one of the handouts that you should have is from a compilation of some classical teachings in the Buddha's words, which was put together by Bhikkhu Bodhi. He's a wonderful translator of the classic original Buddhist text. And this relatively short piece, I think on yours it probably is called the 5 Gifts, Streams of the Wholesome Nourishment of Happiness, maybe called that. This is the Buddha's introduction of these 5 essential precepts, the 5 gifts as streams of merit, one of the ways he spoke about it. In any precept ceremony, by the way, the refuges, which I spoke about, come first. We come home, we take refuge, and once grounded in the refuges, the precepts set us forward. And so if you take a look at that particular handout that I gave you, if you don't want to take a look, it's fine. I'll read some of this to you. Once again, there are about 5 or 6 very brief paragraphs. And these are the oldest words. So I wanted to give you a background, a feel for what it was like when it began. The Buddha said, there are further, and he's saying further because they've taken refuge. There are further, monks, these 5 gifts. Pristine, of long-standing, traditional, ancient, unadulterated, and never before adulterated, that are now being adulterated, and that will not be adulterated, nor despised by wise ascetics and Brahmins. What are these 5 gifts? Well, we'll pause there. So this is the kind of language that was used in the time. There are 5 gifts which I'm going to offer you. And he talks about they've always been around. I said a moment ago, there were no precepts. There weren't official precepts in the Buddhist community yet. But what's the ground of goodness and being and wholesomeness was always there in the Hindu tradition, just like it was in all the other great wisdom traditions. So the Buddha asks, what are the 5 gifts? And he says, here, monks, a noble disciple gives up the destruction of life and abstains from it. By abstaining from the destruction of life, the noble disciple gives to immeasurable beings freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression. By giving to immeasurable beings freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression, he himself will enjoy immeasurable freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression. This is the first of those great gifts and the 4th stream of merit. So once again, what you're going to hear is the repetitive nature of these kinds of teachings, because that's how they were held, because they were oral and they were memorized. And in just this first paragraph, what you hear is, this is the first precept of not killing or not destroying life, by abstaining from the destruction of life. And I think it's beautiful that the Buddha says from the very beginning, by abstaining from killing or destruction of life, you're giving something. The noble disciple gives, offers To immeasurable beings, freedom from fear. I won't hurt you. Hostility and oppression. You can think about this in many, many ways. It's very easy to think about it by abstaining from the destruction, for example, of dark-skinned bodies. This offers immeasurable beings freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression. That's quite a direct and easy one to think of. And by giving immeasurable beings freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression, the person who's doing it, she herself, will enjoy immeasurable freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression. So the Buddha from the very beginning is saying, don't hurt or kill others or anything. And that abstinence from doing that will help others feel free from fear. And guess what? You'll be less afraid also. So I take some time to unfold how the Buddha is offering it, because it's really important. The next paragraph says, further, monks, a noble disciple gives up the taking of what is not given and abstains from it. By abstaining from taking what is not given, the noble disciple gives to immeasurable beings freedom from fear. This is the second of the great gifts. It's the same repetition. By not stealing, you help people be at ease, and you're more at ease. The next one is a repetition. A disciple gives up sexual misconduct and abstains from it. By abstaining, give immeasurable beings freedom from fear, freedom from hostility, freedom from oppression. The next one is false speech, intoxication, then is the last. And he says these monks are the 8 streams of merit. This is from a longer piece where there's more streams. Streams of the wholesome, nourishment of happiness, which are heavenly, ripening in happiness, conducive to heaven, and which lead to whatever is wished for, loved, agreeable to one's welfare and happiness. It's this very ornate, kind of old-fashioned language. But I particularly wanted you to hear the Buddha's words and just speaking about these 5 essentials: not to kill, lie, steal, misuse sexuality, intoxicate, these basic 5, that they are something that one can abstain from, and in abstaining from it, one offers a gift to others. Freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression. And it gives oneself that same freedom. These are the pristine gifts. These are the 5 gifts. So from the beginning, they weren't talked about as 5 rules or commandments or things you shouldn't do. They're actually gifts. There's something offered. And I think that in the Awakening Together Sangha, you have also studied, some of you have studied and attended to Dogen's teachings on the 4 embraces. And the first one is giving, offering. And the paramitas, the first paramita is dana, generosity. You see that this is at the heart of teachings and at the heart of even the precepts. So I hope this gives you a feel for their beginning. One of the things that's essential to understand about the precepts, and I just alluded to it in a way when I said they're not exactly rules. The precepts are like a scaffolding. I remember Blanche talking to me about, she says it's a little bit like a trellis. You know, in your garden you have a trellis of some sort that a vining plant might grow on. And the plant doesn't, suppose there's a grid, it's a common one. I remember my grandmother had these beautiful roses, these tiny little pink roses that they would grow up a trellis. And the rose didn't go like straight up the thing and then turn and go this way and then turn. It didn't follow some rigid plan. What it did is, as it began to grow, it held on. And then it could flourish in another direction and hold on. And then flourish more and hold on. If that trellis had not been there, then the plant would just collapse on itself. It couldn't thrive. It couldn't really express itself fully and become all that it could become. Same with the precepts. But on the other hand, it also doesn't follow some rigid pattern, which wouldn't be itself. It would be some strange manipulated version of the dynamic life force that that plant or that person might have. So the precepts are like this scaffolding or this trellis. They're places for us to hold on, to find a grounding so that we can flourish and become everything. It is not a diminishment. The precepts aren't saying you're a whole big pile of bad stuff and we're going to get you to be on the right track on the straight and narrow. That's what I learned as a kid, but those were called commandments. Rules, parental rules. And the precepts are not those things. They point to the same wholesome behaviors, but they're not those things. They're a place where you, in following this path, become more yourself in a wholesome way, not more of your personality in a conditioned way. That you're already practicing. This is a different kind of practice. But this whole concept makes the precepts much more challenging than a rule-based morality or theology. Because if you have one of those, you know what's right and wrong. This is right, that's wrong. Do this, not that. You don't have to think. You don't have to take responsibility for your life. And the precepts are like, no. We're going to describe what a wakeful person looks like and how they act in the world. If you're awake, if your mind is clear and your heart is open, if you're committed to the care of others and to yourself, if you understand non-separation, that we're all part of one thing, then why would you steal from them? Why would you kill them? Why would you lie? On and on. Because actually it'd be like hurting part of yourself. So you begin to realize from what we just heard in the Buddha's teaching that we might not operate in that clear, wakeful way if we're afraid and therefore become hostile or feel oppressed. Those are the words that the Buddha was using. This is freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression. But it's inviting that freedom in a way that you're required to take full and complete responsibility for your life, for your actions, for your words, for your thoughts, your deeds, and then see how it goes. And continue to pay attention as you go through life, not as a way to criticize yourself, but to continue to be awake. Many of you know that the first thing we do in morning liturgy in a Soto tradition is a chant of confession or repentance. And those kind of words really trigger a lot of us, especially at least I'm more familiar with people in Judeo-Christian traditions, which talk about sin and repentance and judgmental deities and things like that. That's certainly what I was raised on. So you say repentance and confession, it's like, oh boy. But when we say all our ancient tangled or twisted karma, from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, I now fully avow. I now make full confession of who I am. I now stand up in the middle of my life and admit, this is me. And if I'm not willing to turn toward myself and be honest with myself, I don't have a ground to start with, really. I'm continuing to manipulate and try to manage my life instead of come to some sense of truth and honesty about it. It doesn't say feel ashamed of yourself. It just says look at yourself. It doesn't say feel guilty and be oppressed by it. It says turn to someone you love and let them see who you are so they can support you. I now fully avow. And the precepts then give us a direction and a scaffolding to support that kind of really loving and robust kind of relationality. When I was beginning my study of the precepts formally, and I was at San Francisco Zen Center, beginning the early days of my study with Zenke Blanche Hartman, my ordination teacher, we talked about these things. And she gave me the analogy of the trellis, and we talked about how the precepts were different than what I learned in my early days as a good Baptist boy in Texas, And she didn't give me a compendium of the Buddha's teachings. She didn't steer me towards Dogen or even Thich Nhat Hanh or anyone else who might have explicated some of these teachings. She gave me one small piece. And it's more contemporary than the Buddhist teaching, so I'll point you toward it. It's the handout I gave you from Kobun Chino Roshi. Kobun was a first-generation Japanese teacher that came to America, and he was also very poetic, a very unusual language, and he would speak to the deep truths of the teachings in an amazingly heartfelt and poetic way. And this one little paragraph is the only one that Blanche gave me to consider as I began my study of the precepts. And so you might have it in front of you. If you don't, just listen. These are his words. He said he wrote the main subject, and you'll see that I have in parentheses there, of taking the precepts and the Bodhisattva vow. His actual words are the main subject of Denko-e, which is a Japanese term for that. The main subject of taking the precepts and aligning us with the Bodhisattva vow is how to become a transmitter of actual light. Life light. Practice takes place to shape your whole ability to reflect the light coming through you and to generate, maybe to regenerate your system so the light increases its power. Each precept is a remark about hard climbing, maybe climbing down. You don't use the precepts for accomplishing your own personality or fulfilling your dream of your highest image. You don't use the precepts in that way. The precepts are the reflected light world of one precept, which is Buddha's mind itself, which is the presence of Buddha. And Zazen is the first formulation of the accomplishment of Buddha existing. The more you sense the rareness of the value of your own life, the more you realize that how you use it, how you manifest it, is all your responsibility. We face such a big task. So naturally, a person sits down for a while. It's not an intended action. It's a natural action. That's really something, isn't it? I mean, that piece, to me, is incredibly powerful and nuanced and rich. If you took just that piece into the Dharma reflection tonight, and please don't think you're limited to that, that would give you plenty. And also the night after that, and after that, and after that. The main subject of taking the precepts is how to become a transmitter of actual light. Life light. The Buddha said, as he was dying, become a lamp unto yourself. We talk about letting our light shine, this life light. What is this? To take the precepts is to remove whatever barriers there are to your true nature, the natural state of freedom, wakefulness, and awareness, so that it shines through. And then he says in the next sentence, practice takes place to shape you, to shape your whole ability, to reflect the light coming through you. It's already there. It's already coming through you. It's who you are. It's what you're immersed in. You're alive because of this life energy, this life light. So practice helps us shape our ability to generate and regenerate, like solar panels. It's a silly metaphor, but to regenerate your system so the light increases its power, so that the goodness flows more easily, so that this sort of ethical, simple kindness, like the Dalai Lama talks about, moves with an easier grace. This is what the precepts are for. That's why we take refuge first, to begin to remember who we are, to take refuge in that basis, and then to shape ourselves through our practicing of the precepts to allow the goodness of life light to shine through us. It doesn't mean there's not darkness. It doesn't mean there's not difficulty. How do we know that? Because light shines on it and we can see it and we can work with it. And then that curious and powerful sentence that is hard to understand, but when you hear it, you can feel its truth. Each precept is a remark about hard climbing, maybe climbing down. Each precept is a remark, is a mark, is a reflection on this kind of challenge. But when he says in the next sentence, you don't use the precepts to accomplish your own personality, it's not a climbing up. It's not purification. We're going to talk about this later in the next few days. It's not about climbing up, accomplishing your personality, fulfilling your dreams of your highest image. It's about climbing down, going deeper, to discover who you are, what people are, what this life is like. He says you don't use the precepts in this way. The precepts are the reflected light world of one precept. All the precepts are like facets of a diamond that are reflecting one precept, which is Buddha's mind and heart itself. The presence of Buddha, the presence of wakefulness. The presence of wakefulness looks like these different facets when lived through a human being. And Zazen, our sitting, is the first formulation of the accomplishment of that existence. We sit down and stop becoming something else. Finding our way home, remember? Finding our way home. So we can be shaped as a transmitter of life light. And when you do, he says, the more you sense the rareness and value of your own life, when you begin to really sense the rareness and value of your life, not as an idea, it's my experience is it's almost overwhelming. The precious, rare inconceivableness of what it means to have a life. And the more you realize the rareness and value of your own life, the more you realize that how you use it, how you manifest it, is all your responsibility. And then so he makes that statement that's almost like a joke. We face such a big task, so naturally a person sits down for a while. Yep, so that's what we do. And then, but he makes another comment. It's not an intended action, it's a natural action. It's not a manipulation. It's not a manager part of you trying to sit down to meditate so you can become a better person. It's a natural action. you're floored. And it's necessary to sit down, to face what it means to be a human. And what it means to take this responsibility of a precious life and live it with others and assist them in living theirs, which is the Bodhisattva way. And when we begin to wake up and to realize, oh, that's what we're here for. How to become a transmitter of light, life light, for each other. And to practice to shape our way to reflect that light, to use it, to generate it, to regenerate it with and for each other. So the light of our life increases its power as we climb down deeper into what it means to be human, away from the exalted ideas of ourselves and each other. To sit, to take the shape of a Buddha by our posture, to express, rather than attempt to engage in a bunch of activities to try to make ourselves good again, as if there has been something wrong or broken or not quite right about us. There's a beautiful piece in a rather large manual that Roshi Joan Halifax has written from the Paya Zen Center, Santa Fe, about the Bodhisattva precepts and about Jukai and a lot of the whole aspects that surround precepts. And in one of the handouts that I gave you a little piece of it that I thought on this first night is really good. I know I'm giving you a lot, but I want to orient you. And this takes us, we've listened to the Buddha's words, we've listened to a Japanese ancestor's words, and now we're coming here. And Roshi Jones says the precepts were and continue to be a living body of awakening, a way to be Buddha now, and a treasure for our lives as social beings. That sentence is enough. The precepts were and continue to be a living body of awakening. Life light. A way to be Buddha now. Buddha's mind being the essential formulation of our practice. And a treasure that we give for our lives and social beings. The Buddha knew this, she writes, and as he lay dying, he gave his disciples 3 recommendations. He encouraged them to realize the truth of impermanence so they could let go, or I say hold more lightly, their worldly attachments. He asked them to be guided by the precepts so they could stabilize their minds and hearts and live in harmony with each other and all beings. And he encouraged them to be a lamp unto themselves, that is, to take full responsibility for their lives. He realized that living a clear and honest life would be a basis for their liberation from suffering. And that if his successors had strong moral character, their minds would most surely open to inherent natural wisdom and compassion. That is, they would be Buddhas too. And that's actually the secret, that this is about helping you become, to join all the Bodhisattvas, to become the Buddha that you are. She said, when we receive the precepts today, whether we're monks or lay people, we let them open our lives. We let them open us. That climbing down, we let them open us to a deeper truth, that we're not separate from each other. Through living the precepts, we can discover that we are linked by the bonds of suffering as well as the bonds of enlightenment. And in this way, recognize that we share a common body, a common life, and a common aspiration for happiness and peace. I thought this was so beautiful, and it's a gorgeous contemporary echo of our Zen ancestors and the Buddhist teachings from India as we endeavor to find our way home and to walk the Bodhisattva path in this spinning world. So let's take a breather here, because I've given you quite a bit. And maybe you have some questions, or you'd like to come forward with something that this is called up in your own mind, in your own heart, through your own body. So please, if you have such questions or anything that you'd like to bring forward from what we've talked about thus far, I believe in that little icon at the bottom that says reactions, that little smiley face with a plus on it down there. You'll see that there's an option to raise your hand. And if you have something you'd like to speak about, and you raise your hand, Bill will help bring you forward to meet, and we'll be able to talk.
Just one quick thing to let people know. We're going to turn the recording off for this section and resume it when we're done with that.
And so as we complete just the last few minutes of this first significant meeting for the retreat, I hope that our entry into the teachings and remembering of our orientation in coming to this retreat, I hope there's been something that's been generous and encouraging and maybe even inspiring for you, and maybe challenging, certainly. The questions that you've asked let me know that that seems to be happening in some useful way. And I believe that there is a transition now, in just a moment, to a time of discussion or reflection. I would guess that you have plenty to reflect on. Either some of the things that I have given you or what's come up inside of you. And if you spend some time speaking to your present moment, embodied experience, and your groups and your facilitators will help you, of course. You'll find your way together, have confidence in that. Here's the secret. When you're put into your breakout groups and you're with whoever you're with, you're being placed with a bunch of Buddhas. So enjoy them. And I will, even though our time zone is a little bit different, I won't be with you earlier tomorrow. I will in the afternoon. I'll be sitting with you before the Dharma talk, and then we'll come back and we'll plunge back in if that's okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Flint, for your teaching and generous presence.
I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes.